Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Lisa Mladnick, and today I'm with Maureen Wittmann to share together what I learned as a homeschool mom.
Welcome to Homeschooling Saints, the podcast that helps you create the homeschool you love for the people you love. Our host is Lisa Mladnick, a Catholic life coach, TV host, best-selling author, and an instructor at Homeschool Connections.
Before we get started, remember to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the bell to join our channel. Maureen Wittmann is one of the co-owners of Homeschool Connections, as many of you know, and she's also my employer as a podcast host and as an instructor. So I've had the honor of knowing her for over 11 years. Maureen, it's so good to be with you again today.
Thank you, Lisa. It's so good to be here with you. I just always love our time together.
Thank you. And as many of you who have heard the recent episode with Caitlin Zara know, I'm retiring from the show soon at the end of this season, and Caitlin Zara is going to be the new host. You're absolutely going to adore her. And so this is a little bittersweet here. Maureen is someone I really love and respect. And so this is the kind of the winding down of a season together. But what a blessed season it's been. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, is the season of homeschooling and what it taught us. You know, these are the things that we take away that are such gifts. What's coming to mind for you, Maureen?
Oh gosh, so many things.
I know, right?
We start. I often say these days, now that I'm a retired homeschool mom, is I think I got more out of it than the kids did. I relearned all those things in high school that I missed because I either hated school, I despise school. I was too busy looking out the window or thinking about boys or whatever.
I was waiting for you to say that because I think you're so funny.
I really find it interesting. I learned so much academically, but, then I also learned so much about my faith, right? I was a revert. I had a misspent youth. I spent 10 years outside of the church, and the same time I was coming back into the church was the same time I started homeschooling and meeting all these amazing families, dedicated families. So spiritually, I grew and learned, and emotionally and psychologically, learning things like humility and patience. And I guess we all learn that through parenting, but there really is nothing like homeschooling to bring you to your knees.
Oh boy, yeah.
I have a friend many, many years ago, and I may have mentioned this on a previous podcast episode, but she had quit school, homeschooling, put her kids into school. And I asked her one day, what do you miss the most about homeschooling? And she said, my prayer life has really suffered. There's nothing like homeschooling to bring you to your knees. And she meant that in a positive way, just having that regular time with your children every day and being reminded to pray with them. So, yeah, what did I learn as a homeschooler? Gosh, a whole lot. In so many different areas.
Yeah, the whole entering into homeschooling, the way it begins teaches you so much too. For me, it was no question humility, but also God's timing. It took a lot of time for my husband to be on board. We had programs in town, and it was a good school system. I say that in air quotes because, of course, it had loads of problems, too. But we didn't pull our daughter out until after the 4th grade. And by that point, we were finally, like at the very last minute as school was about to start, finally in agreement. And I'm so glad I waited. God's timing was perfect. We were in a better place. We were aligned, so there wasn't a conflict around it. And I needed his support. And so I'm really grateful because I'm a prideful person and I've got a temper, and I often think I know what's best for everyone. And so I'm grateful, as you said, that humility. Sometimes God just gives us a nudge, like a little elbow to the ribs, like surrender this one a little bit. I've got you. I'm doing things you can't see, and I've aligned the timing in the right way.
Yeah, right. And I had a husband who wasn't fully supportive at the beginning. And so I was the opposite of you. I did what I wanted to do. And every summer we would go to all these open houses for the local Catholic school and charter schools. And he works and his life's work has been school choice and charter schools. So in theory, he always supported homeschooling, but he wasn't sure whether or not I could do it, to be frank.
Mm.
And so, yeah, that was, a lesson itself, being able to homeschool without 100% of your husband's support. I mean, he supported me in that he let me do what I wanted to do, but he wasn't 100% on board. I mean, if I had a bad day, the response was going to be, well, just put him in school.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to really learn to do it, not do it on my own. I wouldn't have been able to do that. I learned to do it with the support of my local support group.
Mm.
Right? If it wasn't for all those supportive, loving women in our homeschool group, I wouldn't have been able to do it. But that maybe that's the biggest lesson. I remember when I first met the local homeschool groups, I had little children. My oldest, I think, was 5, so I'm thinking about homeschooling the next year. And I saw, back in the olden days, before the internet, there was an ad in the paper. Oh, thinking about Catholic homeschooling, we meet on first Fridays at this church and go to the park afterwards.
Wow.
Yeah, so we go to this church and go to Mass. And after Mass, someone walked up to me and said, "Are you a homeschooler?" So we hadn't even started yet, but I guess I had it all over my face.
Yeah.
Sure. And she's like, "Well, we're going over to the park. Come join us." I go over to the park and we have a great day playing. And everyone's like, "Well, we're going to go over to Sue's house and have lunch." And I'm like, "Well, I'm not really prepared. I didn't know we were going to do this. I don't have lunch." And it was cold when we left in the morning. So my kids are bundled up, but it's getting hot. And Sue was like, "We'll take care of you. Don't worry." So we get to her house. She feeds us. She gives all my kids T-shirts.
Oh.
And I told me, I'm thinking about homeschooling next year. Someone handed me a Laura Berquist book,
Oh,
How to
great.
Classical Curriculum. Back in the day when Laura was selling it at conferences, like stapled down the middle, published thing. It was homebound. Yeah, it wasn't even, and then Bethlehem Books picked it up, and then I think Ignatius later. So
Yeah, I bought it from Ignatius years later.
Yeah. So I didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea how to get started. I just knew I wanted to do this thing. And they held my hand all the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
That takes me to something that's really burning in my heart to share, and that is God's provision. You were following him. The Holy Spirit was leading and opening doors, and you saw that advertisement and you said yes, and you had the courage to step out and say yes. And it might have been awkward, right? I don't know these people, and here I am with my children. And allowing, as you said, in humility, allowing your needs to be met. You didn't wave your hands and go, no, we're too much bother, and leave. No, you relented and against whatever pride might have been there, and let them serve you. What a gift to them as well.
And I didn't know how I would be accepted. So, again, I'm a revert. I'm a woman with a past. I had been married before, had 2 children, remarried. I haven't the annulment, but,
Yeah.
I didn't know how I would be accepted. I wasn't always a faithful Catholic. And I think I have my Kleenex. They treated me lovingly with open arms, and I was never judged, and I never felt like I was out of place. And I always tell this story. I was some years later, we've been homeschooling a few years, and we were at a friend's house for St. Lucy's Day. So these friends of ours, every year had this party for St. Lucy's Day. They just loved doing this. It was so fun. She'd make the hot cross buns and the whole bit, and
Wonderful.
right, with the candles. And so the moms and I were all talking, and I'm getting animated, and I dropped a bad word. Not too bad, but not a great word. And I was horrified. And Jenny, the mom whose house we're at, she said, "You know what I love about Maureen? She's so earthy." And everyone just laughed, and we all moved on. So
Yeah.
that was another great lesson, was to be accepting and loving of people, and recognizing that not everyone is where we're at, or hasn't always been where we're at, and people can change.
I think, and what a witness to everyone else in that room who occasionally drops, a word or two at home, but would never do it in front of other homeschool moms, because we feel like we have to kind of comply with a cultural norm. Do you know what I'm saying? But to see someone accepted, to be able to be, imperfect by whatever measure, I feel like that's a really important cultural experience, not just for you, but for others, to be able to not have to be demonstrating our piety all the time.
I think it is. I did a talk some years ago, I think it was in Southern California, and the night before the conference, they had kind of a dinner with select group, a smaller group of people. And they had me do my conversion story, which I've never really done publicly. In fact, I was like, this can't be filmed. My parents are still alive.
Oh.
But I gave my conversion story, and I can't tell you how many people came up to me afterwards and said, that's my story too. We think all these Catholic homeschool moms are perfect and have always known and loved the Lord from the second they were born. No, we all have a story, right? We've all had some kind of hardship. And that was really something for me, just how many, and not just the women, but the dads too, who came up and said, we're so glad that you shared that. And just to know they don't have to be perfect. It's okay to expose our frailties sometimes.
Yeah, it can be such a relief to others. And, I'm similar too. I call myself class of 1992 because I'm 65 now. I was 33 at the time that my life really hit rock bottom. I was not well catechized. I fell headlong into the culture, and I was living a life of pain. And it was killing me. So Our Lady came and got me. It's a series of miracles. But just like as you've had that experience of being vulnerable in front of other people and sharing just how lost we can be when we think we're doing things, we think we're living the right life, and then it starts to come apart, or God finds his way into the cracks and woos our hearts.
It's almost a gift. Or it is a gift, I think, to have had those experiences, because would I be empathetic to others if I had not had that experience? And I don't know if I have that in me. If I'm that good of a person that I would have empathy for others if I had not experienced, those trials myself first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I may, in the subject of God's provision, he provides through our stories for others, right? It provides that place where we can be authentic with each other, where we can be known and seen and heard and loved. And that's a greater sense of being part of the body of Christ, right? When one rejoices, the whole body rejoices. When one is in sorrow, the whole body is in sorrow. But I also want to say that it took me, I was reading books on homeschooling and wanting to homeschool before my daughter was born. She was a late life miracle as far as I was concerned. I was almost 40 when I had her, and she's my only. And by the time she was born, I was so on board with homeschooling, but it took me, as I said, until right at the end of the summer after her fourth grade year, literally a couple of days before school was about to start, my husband finally said yes. The next day, and then that day I ordered a box of books from Seton. I was like, I'm on it. I just picked him up and called and ordered the book. The next day he found out he was losing his job.
Oh my goodness gracious.
He did part-time and temporary work for the next 3 years. So we started our homeschool journey in financial instability. Now, we were always savers and lived below our means and blah, 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 but we had a mortgage. We had health insurance to buy and all those things. And so I started doing, little part-time side hustles and things like that. But this incredible blessing of Homeschool Connections came about 4 years in 2013. So God provided what we need to get through those 3 years, and the homeschooling didn't stop. He didn't say, changed my mind, you need to go to work. And he could have very well done that.
Yeah.
But he didn't. God provided the grace. And my husband's not a believer, so he wouldn't have said, wow, I'm having a moment of grace here. So from telling our stories to God's provision of the practical things, somehow if it is God's will, if we're doing our best to say yes to him, he provides. He really does.
That has me thinking now, another lesson that I hadn't thought of before is, the lesson of frugality, right? So my husband worked in nonprofits the bulk of his career. Right? The first 20 years we were married, he worked for nonprofits and did not make a lot of money. In fact, I made 3 times the money he made in payroll and human resource management. And so that was a big pay cut. When I became a stay-at-home mom, I was pregnant with my third child when I became a stay-at-home mom. And you know what? So many benefits from that. Right? We had to learn to live frugally. We drove old cars, wore hand-me-down, shopped at Salvation Army.
Mm-hmm.
I canned, preserved food, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think all my children have really benefited from that. So I learned, I went from having my hair and nails done on a regular basis and shopping for business suits to, the denim jumper.
Yeah. Very practical.
Right. So, I think that's another great lesson I got from homeschooling was you can have a beautiful, joyful life and not chasing a paycheck.
Yeah.
Because, right, all us homeschool families, the bulk of us are living in a 2-income world on 1 income.
Yes.
So materialism has to go out the door.
It's so true. I was so touched. I remember discovering this universe of homeschool families happened before I had my husband's agreement, because I used to get permission from my daughter's principal at the public school to take her out early on Wednesdays because they were doing a science program on Long Island for young kids that was fantastic. And so because it was academic enrichment. So I was hanging out with these families that cared, it's going to make me cry, that cared so much about their children and how their children were being formed. I'd never met anyone like that in my life in the flesh. And here were these people sacrificing a great deal materially, who had deep thoughts about it, who had philosophies, who supported each other in the practical day-to-day of struggles and, pain and sickness and all those things. They were willing to be kind of on a shoestring together, but being creative, resourceful, and very deeply connected to each other. So I must say, the quality of the human beings that God provided blew my mind.
I did not know people like that existed. I mean, I joined when I joined this homeschool group in Lansing, I was pregnant 6 months pregnant with my fourth. And they hardly knew me. They knew me a couple months, right? I have this baby, and next thing I know, there is a meal train.
Oh, wow. I love it.
And I'm like, what is this? Like, I've never heard of such a thing. Like, people hardly know me, and you're bringing me food? Like, I did not know that people like that existed, that were so in love with the Lord that they were. I remember someone saying, we love to talk a lot about community in our culture. The only real community I've ever seen is the homeschool community, where people actually do bond together and help one another. A friend of my husband's, who was a school principal, he's a principal, and then he was a superintendent, and he left the public school system and went and worked in private industry helping homeschoolers. And he said, look, here's what I discovered. When I would go to meetings with school parents, the talk was always about how, my Billy's getting an A in math and my Susie is the, head cheerleader or whatever. It's always kind of a bragging thing, trying to show that, I am a good parent. I said, but what I see is when I go to homeschool events, it's always like, my Billy is struggling at math. Oh, you know what? I use this. Let me help you. Or, Susie's struggling with phonics. Oh, I use this program, or I'm having the same struggle. Maybe we can figure it out together.
Yeah.
So, if you don't have that kind of community locally, build it. I know not everyone has that loving community locally, but maybe God's calling you to be the person to start it, or to be the change, or to set that tone. I think it's a little more difficult today because of the internet. People aren't as connected as they used to be. But I think post-pandemic, we're kind of seeing a move back towards, local in person. But yeah, make sure that you're opening up your home and you're reaching out and you're helping that new person, that mom who shows up and no one knows who she is. Walk up to her and say, hey, are you a homeschooler? And invite her to the park.
I remember one homeschool mom sharing, because we have a big network here, that she was terrified when she came to the first homeschool event. as a new homeschooler, maybe just contemplating it, and completely overwhelmed, expecting to be surrounded by educational geniuses and that she'd be outclassed and wouldn't fit in and wouldn't be enough. And God led her right to one of our most wonderful moms in the network, and she was confiding to her how inadequate she felt. And this woman that she's talking to, I'll just tell you her first name, Tracy, threw her head back and laughed and said, "If I can homeschool, anybody can." And they had a great laugh about it. I mean, just that human to human contact, that reassurance, that because our spiritual enemy gets in our heads and wants us to feel inadequate. But anyway, we're going to talk a lot more with Maureen Wittmann. We'll be right back after a short sponsor break. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Walter Crawford.
And I'm Maureen Wittmann.
We are the co-founders of homeschoolconnections.com and proud sponsors of the Homeschooling Saints podcast,
which is here to help you homeschool more joyfully, more easily, and more effectively.
We want to thank you for listening.
And we invite you to check out our courses at homeschoolconnections.com.
And now, back to our program.
All right, we're back with Maureen Wittmann, and we're talking about what I learned as a homeschool mom. And Maureen, something really stuck out to me. You said earlier that as you were homeschooling, you learned a lot yourself, because you were distracted with the boys and didn't like school or whatever, but now it's filling in the gaps. So many people considering homeschooling are intimidated by the academics. They're afraid they're not going to measure up. So where can you take us on that one?
Yeah, I hear that every day, right? I mean, the big stumbling point for parents is always, am I enough? Am I enough? That's what I hear every day from our parents. And you are enough. You really, you love your child more than anyone else, and you can do this. And, to be frank, if you're teaching a first grader, all you need to know is first grade. I think you can do that, right? You're alongside them. And that's the beauty of it. And that's what I was saying earlier, where one of the things I loved about homeschooling was relearning all these things that were fascinating and learning it in a new and different way. So, we did a lot of living literature, and, right. So history wasn't just about memorizing dates and reading from a textbook. We might use a textbook as a spine, but we also read a lot of historical fiction and biographies and speeches. Actual speeches are made, or watched, documentaries, and went to museums. Right. It was a blast, and I loved it. And really, to be honest, I only had to stay a couple of weeks ahead of the kids. Right. So if I'm in third grade, I only need to be, have a third grade knowledge. I would read ahead their lessons to make sure that I knew what I was doing. Sometimes I would watch Homeschool Connections. I was just sharing this with a mom who wanted to work with her son one-on-one, and didn't want him to do a class, but I'm like, go watch Joseph Pierce's videos on Lord of the Rings, and then, that's going to equip you to turn around and give the lesson,
So smart. I
Right?
love that.
I used to do that before, I led the book club for like 15 years, and every now and then I would cheat and go watch.
That's not cheating. That is so smart, because you're helping yourself learn. You're priming the pump. You're filling yourself up to overflowing, and then you can bring all that beauty through your unique lens for those particular children.
Yeah. So, it all goes back to one thing you and I always kind of fall back on every time you and I talk is, right, the joy of homeschooling. You need to find joy in learning and really have fun with it. So if you're learning alongside them, it's much more fun for them, right? It's much more motivating to see, my mom is learning Latin. Maybe I want to learn that too. I have a friend, Cecilia, who was teaching herself Italian and all these different languages. I mean, how inspiring for her own self.
Yes.
Was that for her children, when it came time for them to learn languages. So, if you have a high school diploma, you can teach your high school child. You can do that. You don't have to have a master's degree in education. In fact, a master's degree in education teaches you how to teach in a large classroom. It's about classroom management and pedagogical approaches, et cetera. I have friends who, were classroom teachers who struggled at first homeschooling, because it really is a different pedagogical approach. You're teaching one-on-one. You're not teaching a large classroom, and it takes a lot of time. You're not, it's something else you'll learn if you're just getting into it, because you don't have classroom management. you don't do what's called warehousing. So warehousing takes up, I think, like maybe almost 25, 30% of the time in classrooms, which is warehousing is taking roll, changing classrooms, dealing with, other issues. You don't have that in homeschooling, so things get done a lot quicker. So don't ever doubt that you can do this, I think maybe in another episode, I talked about a study that was done, I think by NERI, NERI, National Education Resource something. We'll find it and put it in the show notes.
We will.
But they did a study, and what they found was when you look at testing scores, so, in site-based schools and public schools, children's grades, children's scores weighed heavily on whether or not the parents had advanced degrees, on their income level, and on their race. So, a white parent with a PhD who's making six figures is going to do way better than a child who is a person of color and whose parents have a lower income and have a high school diploma. But when they studied homeschoolers, that was not true. The person making $150,000, their kids scored the same as the person making $25,000, right? The person who was white, Black, Asian, whatever, all scored the same. The only difference they saw was the parent with the PhD, their child scored a tiny bit better than the parent with the high school diploma. So what's the difference? Why is that? Well, it's because you're prejudging your children based on their socioeconomic position in life, on where you're not judging them based on where they live or where they come from. You love that child more than anyone else, and you're going to make sure that they succeed. And that's why your child will benefit from you homeschooling, whether you have a high school diploma, a 2-year college degree, 4-year, or master's, PhD, whatever. You're going to make sure that child succeeds, and your child's going to do just fine, as long as you're learning beside them, you're finding the joy in what you're doing, and you bring God into it, and you're prayerful, and you following the Holy Spirit's lead, and connect with that local community. Yeah, and you can do it. You are enough.
Yeah. And some moms are so good at all the schedules and all the routines and getting everything perfect. And some moms like me are a lot more kind of spontaneous, impulsive, outsource more, gravitate towards co-ops and mutual support and things like that. Like there's a way to homeschool for every parent and every child. And like some families have kids in school and other kids at home. And so I just want to encourage anyone listening that these results don't come from any of us doing it the same way or doing it perfectly. It's just what Maureen said. You love your child, and there's something holy about that. God is helping you. That's it. That is, like, as you mentioned, inviting God into the mix, right? This is a supernatural partnership as well as an earthly, everyday, temporal struggle with all its joys and adventures. So I just want to encourage everybody to really trust that this is something that will unfold in a unique way. And that was a big growth area for me too, as a mom, to be able to be enough as a mother, and for fathers, some fathers are homeschooling too. Maybe, I don't know if they feel the same way, but being a late life mom and having been out in the world so much and having had so few friends that shared my faith over the years, that I learned gentleness as well as courage from these homeschool moms. I learned that I could tackle a whole new horizon academically, that there would be people doing it with me, that there would be resources, that if we had a bad day, it was okay. But the gentleness and the patience of other mothers really blew my mind. Because if you're kind of a perimenopausal first-time mom and used to being able to have complete freedom, and so maybe you're I'm not talking about anyone in particular, by the way, you're a little testy at times and impatient, and you're around other moms who have multiple children and have learned not to sweat the bad days and to be patient about the little problems their kids have and not think it just shines this spotlight on them as being failures as mothers, right? They take everything in stride. So someone like me coming in, I was quite the oddball with my one kid in tow and my cranky personality. I grew a lot as a mother. I absorbed a kind of heroic virtue that I had not been exposed to very much in my life.
It's so beautiful. I was talking to a friend of mine, Noelle, recently, who's graduated her children, and they've turned out pretty amazing. And she's like, when I started homeschooling, I'm like, I am not going to be good at this. I'm going to be the worst homeschooler ever, right? She's like, I was. I was not organized. I didn't have little schedules. I didn't have little charts, right? And, but by whose standard? That's the question. By whose standard am I a good homeschooler? By whose standard am I the best homeschooler? So it's like what you just said. Every family is unique. Every child is different. And you may homeschool differently than someone else. Someone else does great by having charts and plans, and someone else can be a total unschooler, and their children are just as successful.
Yes.
Right. And that's the beauty of you teaching as a home educator. The beauty of you teaching as a mother is not only do you love that child more than anyone else, you know them better than anyone else, and you know what works for them. And, I can't imagine how hard of a job it is for a school teacher teaching 25 unique individuals who all learn differently. Kudos to those men and women, because it's got to be a hard job. But teaching one-on-one, we can address that. And, it's like, we have another friend who she had envisioned, this super organized homeschool, and her son did not do well. And he flourished when she just let go of all the plans and let him kind of just learn on his own. He loved to read like manuals, like how machines worked. And he,
oh my goodness,
he was like computer genius, but just throwing out the lesson plans one day, where another child needs that lesson plan. They need that organization. They need, you can't be flying by the seat of your pants. So yeah, every homeschool is going to be different. And it's okay if you're not homeschooling the same as your neighbor,
Yeah. I love that you just touched on the uniqueness of the child. We've sort of been playing around in the space of the uniqueness of the mother or the father that's homeschooling. But this ability to adapt to the uniqueness of the child, that child needed to get his hands on things. And in a public school, that would have happened hardly at all. In fact, he would have been branded a bad kid for being fidgety and physical and not wanting to sit all the time, right? So instead of being kind of dinged and bent by a system that couldn't accommodate his particular way of learning, he got to thrive. I think it was Chesterton who wrote I think I was just talking about this with somebody else too on another podcast, but this idea that the home is the place where we can be dramatically different from anybody else. Because you go out into the world and everybody seems to get into lockstep. But in the home, this amazing kind of magical thing happens, or mystical, I guess we would say in our faith, that the unique individual, that unique and unrepeatable person, that person who is essential to God's plan for salvation, can start to discover what lights them up, where they're naturally strong, what wants them to do more and put their own effort and love into something. Just say a little about your own discovery of the uniqueness of your children, Maureen.
Well, one thing that really struck me in what you were just saying is homeschooling allows our children to be free to be who they are. So, what did I learn in school? I had to be like everyone else to be accepted. There was a lot of bullying in school, and if you weren't like everyone else and, one little different thing, you got teased. And of course, siblings are going to tease you. But it's a little different. I think that my children were able to be who they truly were and be comfortable in that. So, every one of my children came from me, came from the same parents, and they're so different and so unique. I have one child who I'm sure would have, teachers would have begged me to put him on Ritalin if he went to school. But I just learned, okay, he can only absorb lessons when he was little, maybe 10 minutes, and we take a break. Then, 20 minutes, half an hour, and then, maybe a lesson for half an hour, and he runs outside and burns off energy, gets on the swing set, eats an apple, and then set the timer, have him come back. We were able to work around that. He couldn't do that in a school setting, or my oldest son, we've talked about him here on the podcast, who is dyslexia, severely dyslexic. And the public school told me, He will never read beyond middle school level. And it was long and hard. It wasn't easy.
Mm-hmm.
I taught him to read, and it wasn't easy on him, more so than me. It was tough. But because he was at home and he was homeschooled, I could read aloud his other lessons, so he didn't get behind in other subjects. He wasn't made to feel inferior because he was getting pulled out to go to dummy class. He loved reading because reading was cuddling up with mom and being read to. That's a good, warm, fuzzy memory. So yeah, he didn't take off till he was 10, but by 13, he was at college level. Once he took off, there was no stopping him, I have a child who was painfully shy, and everyone told me, you got to put her in school. You got to put her in school. They don't have shy people in school? What?
Uh-huh.
And I had family members who were painfully shy, and they never came out of it, right? I mean, they would be thrown into social situations and would totally just withdraw worse. So I thought throwing her into school isn't going to make her better. So what happened? I mean, she's a social butterfly. She's the one who organizes everything and always wants to go on an adventure and, plans out the family Jeopardy at Christmas. And
I love it.
and she has no trouble making new friends and walking up to strangers and saying hi. But why? When she was so painfully shy as well, I think because she was accepted for who she was. We didn't push her into things. So my mom would tell me stories about my aunt who was painfully shy, and my grandpa she'd hide under the table when company would come, and he'd drag her into these situations.
Oh my goodness.
We just let this child be shy and just let her know she was loved, and she eventually worked her way through it.
Yeah.
So, some kids were slower at learning things, some were really quick, and every child had their own thing they were good at. And, I had kids who did shooting sports and other ones who loved to ride horses. And we were able to address all those things. If they really loved something, then I would go out of my way to make sure they had, they were able to do it. I've been to a lot of dressage horse riding competitions, and I've traveled all over the country going to shooting sports events. And
wonderful.
It's all education, and a lot of those things we were able to do because, as I said before, homeschooling doesn't take as much time. So you have more time to do those things they enjoy. And what's the best gift we can give our children but a beautiful childhood? And their childhood doesn't have to be all school. Childhood is a lot more than school.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to be learned just playing outside in the woods and going to the beach, or doing a pickup game of soccer or football, or at my house, ice hockey.
This has been such a great discussion, Maureen, and we could go on and on. We've been friends a long time, and this is such a rich topic, and I'm sure moms listening are going, well, what about this? What about that? It teaches so many lessons. What's a final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Just, you are enough. And you're going to learn so much from homeschooling. You're going to learn academics. You're going to relearn all those fun history facts, and you're going to discover beautiful literature. And you're going to find that even math can be interesting. And, be open to it. Find the joy in learning beside your children. And, again, be open to learning from your fellow homeschool moms and your spouse, and learn from your children. It's a beautiful experience. And yes, you may learn more than your kids. You may get more out of it than your own children. And they may grow up and homeschool their own children. So,
yeah. As many do.
Yeah, right.
Oh, Maureen, thank you so much. As we're starting to wrap up, it's a little emotional for me because this is the last time you and I will be on the air together. It's been a beautiful 6 seasons, and Homeschool Connections has been a big part of our homeschooling journey, too, through our high school years. And I have to say, my daughter still talks about things that she learned here. So we learned not to go it alone, and that we had a family out there. Some of it was online and some of it was in person. But there are ways, and God did go before us and provide and nurture and develop our virtues. So thank you for being a great example to me of patience, of gentleness, of really being able to take people right where they are and meet them there. You've been there for me and for many, many others that I know of that have been influenced by you. So thank you. It's been just an incredible joy.
Well, and thank you, Lisa. Did you believe we've been doing this 6 years?
It's amazing.
And it's been such a blessing. I hear from guests all the time who call me and say, that was the best interview I ever did. Lisa's always so well prepared. It makes you feel so welcomed and lets you talk. So it's been such a blessing to have you teach for us and to do the podcast. And ditto to everything you said. I've learned so much from you, and just your beautiful, gentle, kind spirit. Thank you. And I'd say more, but I'll start crying.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to, all praise and glory to God. Lord, thank you. Thank you for everyone listening. And everyone, thank you for joining us. God bless you in your walk with God, in this adventure of home education. And wherever we are meeting you today, thank you for having us in your ear. And there's still more of our season to come. And do be praying for our next host who will be taking over for season 7, Caitlin Zara, a beautiful young homeschooling mom who's blogging for the company already and spoke at a recent conference. So do pray for her and her family as they're getting ready as we pass the torch in joy, in friendship. We thank you all so much. And thank you again, Maureen.
Thank you. So everyone pray for us. We'll be praying for you.
Amen.
Amen.
And that's our show for today. Our program is sponsored by homeschoolconnections.com. Be sure to subscribe to Homeschooling Saints and leave us an honest review. God bless you, and thank you for joining us.